Neil's covered the rest of the general conditions, so we'll dive into GC6, or GC6 as it's more technically known, except my button isn't working. There we go. This one's caused us, and probably a lot of you, a lot of grief recently, so we're sort of take a bit of an overview of it. So Ofcom introduced a new general condition which required communication providers to, well, they've always had that, but the CLI data must include a valid dialable telephone number which uniquely identifies the caller. It's a great idea. You know, we actually like this idea. It should, you know, stop nuisance calling. We should be able to identify who makes phone calls. Doesn't really work like that. So, bit of background, we deal mainly with C7 interconnects, regulated interconnects. We don't deal with that many other PSTN networks by SIP. We still do everything in C7. So there's the C7 ISIP world and how it works with SIP, which I suppose some of you will know, some of you won't. In theory, all calls have a caller ID. Well, no, most calls have a caller ID. And more specifically, most calls have at least one caller ID. Not only one, and sometimes none. Simply, there's two parameters on the ISIP layer. There's the network number and the presentation number. These are mapped in SIP to p-asserted identity and the from header. And if anyone cares, that's the standard that defines this. So we're not making this up, despite the fact people seem to want to argue with us about it. This is an NICC standard. Your platform must support both of these, per the new general condition C6. You can't choose just to look at PAI or just to look at from. You must support both, and end users must only ever see the presentation number, unless there isn't one. So, what do we as CPs or you as CPs do, and how can we help as SimWood? So we'll look at two cases. Both this applies to outbound calls and inbound calls. You've got obligations on both. I should say I'm not a lawyer. You want one of them? He is.
Everyone's perfect, Ross.
True. So, from an outbound point of view, and we'll clarify that as calls to the PSTN from SimWood, all calls must have a valid caller ID. So, general conditions require that you must prevent a valid, dialable telephone number which uniquely identifies the caller. They've also clarified that this responsibility falls to all CPs involved in the transmission. So if you're another sort of reseller and you've got sort of customers reselling to other customers, they're responsible for it, you're responsible for it, we're responsible for it, and ultimately whoever we pass it on to, you know, is responsible for it as well. And there are three criteria there: valid, dialable, and uniquely identifies the caller. So it must be valid. Well, what's valid? A valid number must comply with the E164 numbering plan, i.e. must be a full number, must be of an appropriate length. If it's a UK number, it must be in the National Telephone Numbering Plan. But not only that, it must be shown as allocated. So in theory, 016329884 might be a number, it's a valid number, the right range, etc. It's a valid range. If that's not currently allocated to a CP, you should not present it as CLI. It must be dialable. So it also has to be in service, i.e. allocated to a customer. And it must be able to receive a return call. So whilst it used to be accepted, it was always very annoying for people to make outbound calls with numbers that you can't call back. Because they're technically allocated, that's fine, that's not. And that's not just applicable to dialer traffic, that is any call. It must have a number that can receive a call. Also needs to uniquely identify the caller. So that can either be an individual or an organization. The user must have authority to use the number. Now that's either because the number's been given to that user by direct allocation, or permission from a third party, which obviously covers the case where you might operate a call center dialing out on behalf of RBS, the real RBS, not, you know, phoning people up and pretending to be RBS. And you know, you then have the right to present RBS's number. That's, you know, that's perfectly clear. So that's presentation number. They also have to have a valid network number. So the network number is the same. It doesn't need to be dialable, but it must be allocated to the originating CP or a number that has been imported into their network. Now that seems very clear, However, we'll get onto it in a minute. So Ofcom in their wisdom decided that there is a chance that a call might not have a valid network number, or the network number might not be on your network. So case in point, you've received a call, you operate a hosted PBX service, someone forwards the call to somewhere else, you want to present the mobile number, it's a presentation number, that's fine. What's the network number? You can't present the mobile number. If you allocate a number to that customer, you can present that number. But if you don't, and you don't provide any inbound numbers to them directly, then in theory, you can't provide a number that's been allocated to you or imported into your network or our network. So the whole point of this is that this absolutely identifies where a call came in. If it's got a SimWood network number, that call came from SimWood, because of course people couldn't possibly spoof it. And to this end, Ofcom came up with this wonderful range of 08979, which bears a remarkable resemblance to a premium rate service, but never mind. So, these are for inserted network numbers. And this is what Ofcom said at the time, where the CP at the point of ingress does not reasonably trust the CLI data being provided, or where that data is unavailable, the CP should insert a CLI from a range that has been allocated to them for this purpose. Again, this seems really clear. If you don't reasonably trust the CLI that your customer's given you, insert a network number. So there we go. It restores consumer confidence in CLI. Brilliant. We can now trace nuisance calls. If we see a network number, we know that's where it came from. Apparently, though, we interpreted it wrongly, including according to Ofcom. So that's what Ofcom say. So basically, network number must be the fixed access ingress to or egress from a PECN, i.e. us, or the first known UK PECN in the call path, which again, us. Or where they don't reasonably trust that the CLI is reliable. And the authenticity of a network number is guaranteed. So we're not allowed to send anything on unless we can guarantee it's authentic. Then I got this email from Ofcom, which says the inserted number should only be used in this situation and details international calling, and not for calls that originate in the UK. I can't actually remember the context of that email. I argue with Ofcom on a daily basis. EE, thank you, that was it. So yeah, the context of that email. We had a bit of a debate with EE because EE were presenting our network number to customers. People were calling out, customers were seeing 08979. Instead of taking the fact that that's wrong anyway, they should never have shown the network number. That's back in one of the earlier slides. Ofcom then got really hung up on the fact that we were inserting an 08979 and not passing what their mind was a valid network number, which would seem to contradict their own guidelines. Which ironically, in that email, where it says the CLI guidelines that's linked in blue at the top, that's the document behind it. So it directly contradicts itself. So yeah, great idea, and without sort of blowing our own trumpet, Simon has blogged about this more than once with things like bigger fines for those they still can't find. We would love to see something done to tackle nuisance calling. If we could identify where a call comes into the network, that would be brilliant, but we can't. So that's inbound. So ultimately, it's outbound, so outbound call from you. So what we do, we try our best to make you compliant with this in a way that we think is compatible with the legislation, and having spoken with Neil, the way that he agreed at the time is compatible with the legislation, and the way that ITSPA have agreed is compatible with the legislation, and 2 or 3 other communications providers that we work quite closely with. Ofcom don't agree and they wrote the legislation, but we'll leave that aside. So the first test is, if you've sent us a PAI, if you've sent us P-asserted identity, is it on your SimWood account? If so, we use it as the network number. Simple, meets the requirement, directly allocated to you, sorted. If not, is it valid? If it is, we'll set it as the presentation number, and that's mainly to cater for things like misconfigured PBXs that send a from line of Bob 101, which we obviously can't put out on the PSTN, and the PAI has what we would call the calling party number. Most American software works that way by default. So we then use that as the presentation number, and we set the network number for you. If there's a default network number on your account, or trunk, which again, we allow to be set, then we'll use that. Otherwise, we will use an 08979. For from, is the from number a valid number? If so, we'll use it as the presentation number. If there's no valid CLI in the from or the PAI now, we block the call. And we have warned about this for some time. Basically, invalid CLI is not allowed at all. So if you let your customers set your own CLI, you are responsible for blocking it. Ofcom have made this blatantly clear. CLI must be valid. You shouldn't be sending invalid CLI to us or to anyone else. We do our best to mangle it, as we've just described earlier, so that calls complete. If we didn't do that, there'd be quite a lot of calls would fail. Even then, we drop quite a lot of calls from people who've just not configured something or sent nothing at all as CLI. There's also an obligation inbound from other networks into use. If you've got a call you're sending on to your customer, you have obligations to handle CLI. So we'll look back at the original obligations. Valid, dialable, uniquely identifies the caller. Well, Ofcom aren't completely unreasonable. They have determined you can't uniquely identify the caller because you don't know who the caller is, but the number still must be valid and dialable. So it's the same requirement as before. You must ensure a call has a valid and dialable CLI. They have qualified this where technically feasible. However, I would argue that anyone running an IP-based, SIP-based telephony platform that can't work out whether a CLI is the right length and in a database, it is technically feasible. There's no question about that. Must ensure that only valid and dialable CLI data is presented to the end user. Ofcom even go as far as to say CPs for international calls should check the CLI has the correct number of digits. So calls shouldn't arrive with missing digits or short CLIs or anything like that. You also have an obligation to block invalid calls. C6 put a new obligation on CPs to take steps to prevent these calls reaching the called party. So anything that's not from an allocated range, and they've actually laid this out as an example, or for international calls, a number that's not in the correct format. So obviously there are inbound obligations, and not that many people seem to follow them yet. We can help. Ofcom acknowledge this. They actually say you can work with upstream providers to ensure any calls connected to their network of CLI, and that will meet the requirements of GC6.4. I've sort of said at the bottom, coming very soon. Having just said this is easy, it isn't. At least it's not quite as easy as expected. We found a lot of inconsistencies with the way some other networks handle CLI on the C7 level for various reasons. Until we are 100% sure that we can say, by ticking this box in the portal, you are compliant with General Condition C6, we're not going to say, by ticking this box in the portal, you are compliant with General Condition C6, because someone will call Neil and Neil will sue us. So you're not compliant yet, don't worry. Neither are BT, O2, EE3, Virgin or Vodafone. I either use or know people that use all of these, and in the last 2 weeks alone before producing this slide, we have all received calls from numbers that are not on the national numbering plan, invariably telling us we've been in a car accident that we've somehow forgotten about, or that we can claim some government incentive that doesn't exist. There's another consideration with the new sort of CLI rules, and that's one around privacy. Again, Neil's the expert here. Back in May 2014, Ofcom sent an email with very small text, which basically, the long and the short of it is the consumer's right to withhold their number is absolute. Under no circumstances, if someone has sent a number withheld, can you then pass that number to the called party. The irony is this is an email about privacy, and Ofcom sent it with every CP in the country in the to line. These are direct personal email addresses of every communications provider, pretty much. Yeah, great. So withheld CLI must be respected, and that's how it now appears in GC6. It's obviously the responsibility to ensure that these markings are preserved. You can present them, again, if you're a wholesale provider, or you've got a reseller provider, and they've got their own PBXs, you can give them it in PAI. You're allowed to pass that on, that's fine, but it must not reach the end user's handset. There was a debate recently, I can't remember the specifics of it, and the question was, if someone's got a soft phone on their phone, or like a Sangoma handset, or any sort of hardware VoIP phone, if you pass it to the phone, is it the phone's obligation not to show it to the end user? Because at that point it's just in signaling. The answer is no, it's not. It's you as the provider's obligation not to pass it to the phone. The relevant regulations are PECR, regulations 10 to 13, 19 to 21, again if you want to look it up. There's another consideration around end user CLI data, which is simply that CLI data is personal data as far as GDPR is concerned. So it should only be used where it's essential to provide a service. It should be limited to essential personnel, e.g. network management, fault finding, or for compliance reasons. Every man and their dog shouldn't be able to see CDRs of your customers, for instance. You cannot use it for marketing or any other commercial purposes. And obviously, withheld numbers must not be passed to a third party that is not a CP. Again, this is lifted straight from Ofcom. Unfortunately, I've lost the citation. But if the third party is a CP, you can pass it on. So if another CP asks you about a call, yeah, you can pass that on, but it cannot be passed on to any other third party, if it was withheld. Going back to what I said earlier, as far as SimWood's concerned, calls that do not have valid ID will not complete. That is printed the same way as that on the blog on every article but caller ID, white, black background, big clear warning. I would still say we get 3 or 4 tickets a week from people saying, why doesn't this call work? And in the X reason header in the reply, invalid CLI. We've stopped completing these calls. We do now start to see the response, XYZ Telco will complete it. I don't know if there is a company called XYZ Telecom. I don't know. But if that's the case, they're not compliant with General Condition 6. We would rather stop that traffic rather than avoid us being dragged into the equation, because as Ofcom have said, it's everyone's responsibility. But nonetheless, we'd rather you weren't caught up in it either. As you met Tom in his introduction this morning from the US, we are now doing stuff across the pond. So what have they got across the USA? It's interesting. They've got something called stir and shaken, or shaken and stirred, depending what way you want to look at it. It's actually a really intelligent solution. It uses public key cryptography, much like DNSSEC. Basically, for every single call, we now have to verify the CLI using a signature in the SIP. Now, obviously, we're offering US numbering. We're going to offer various other services in the US through time, and we're taking care of this for you. But there is obviously quite a lot of work around building it, which is why it's not as simple as just putting American numbers and saying, well, here you go, you've got American numbering. Once this comes into play, which I think will be regulatory required, is it 2021?
No, it's got to be done by the end of this year.
End of this year. Okay, so end of 2019. After that point, calls that you present using a US CLI that can't be verified in this way would not complete in the US. So the plus side is it will be almost impossible to spoof a CLI, which is what Ofcom were going for, albeit in a roundabout way. So I've tried to rush, I probably have rushed through this. I speak far too quickly. It's where I'm from rather than anything else, but we're also a wee bit behind schedule. So that's sort of my summary on GC6 and no more. But does anyone have any questions before we let you loose?
I have a question and a comment.
Yep,
Okay.
question and a comment. Okay.
So my question is, I don't know if this mic's working, but I'll go through the motions.
Mike's working for the feed, but not for people in the room.
We've had numerous tickets in recent weeks from people saying CLI should be passed in E164 format and it isn't.
Mm-hmm.
Which isn't my interpretation of the requirements, but is a literal interpretation of the requirements. So I'd be interested in your comment around that, and then I have a comment on GC6 generally when you're done.
Well, the other NICC document, and don't ask me to quote it, it's either 1016 or 1017, sets down a standard for communications providers for SIP to SIP interworking and for SIP to ISUP interworking. And the official standard is we should all be using E164 format. Technically, we should all have the plus at the start of it, and technically we should also have semicolon user equals phone on the end of it. And for special services like UK 118500, we should have semicolon phone context equals +44. We've not got all that either, because most people don't configure it and it just doesn't work. So we've sort of settled for something that works. We do offer E164 if people want it, but you can have whatever format you want. Out of interest, just to sort of show of hands in the room, who here, when they're processing numbers, be it CDRs, things, who normalizes to E164, i.e. 441?
With the plus sign.
With the plus sign.
What, for outbound call? When we're sending an outbound call to you?
For anything, or for CDRs, or for anything at all?
Yeah.
Yes, so you do. And who uses UK national format like 01? I'm talking about database level, not what you present your customers, because obviously they don't want to see. Yeah, so most people use E164. It's a nice simple standard, and you don't need to worry about what country the call was from.
It was then we process it inside the front end to remove that. For the
Because you get oddities like, is 01236 area code in Scotland somewhere, or is it 1236, which is a US state, and you do get that issue. The reason historically we don't put the plus in, which we'll touch on a bit tomorrow in our architecture talk, is we do a lot of stuff with HTTP and XML RPC internally, and the scripts we had when we started doing it 8 or 9 years ago would just see the plus as a space, and there would be horrible inconsistencies, so we just took the plus off. But internally we now use E164 everywhere without the plus.
And
Your
customers
comment?
can get E164 if
Customers
they want
can get E164 if they want E164. It is now an option in the portal from last week, I think, and it can be switched on. You can have it on a different basis per trunk. So if you've got a trunk that directly serves someone's PBX, you can have it in UK format if they want. That's fine.
And my comment was around GC6. So credit to Ross. He's led a lot of the industry thinking on this in forums such as ITSPA, and it's been quite nice to see him creating a role and a niche for himself in that respect. And it's obviously quite nice for Simwood to be in that position. But I'm kind of frustrated with GC6. Ofcom aren't my favourite people anyway. But when everybody interprets their own rules differently to themselves, and the interpretation of everybody else is sensible, and their interpretation happens to match EE but is stupid, it's kind of frustrating. So Neil might want to cover his ears here, because there might be some work coming as a result of it. I'm this close to turning off a lot of what we've implemented with GC6 on outbound calls, because the reality is we've implemented things in good faith and nobody else has bothered, and people are still arguing about what it means. So that is having a direct consequence for some of you when your customers are making calls, and weird stuff is happening on EE handsets that I would argue is causing consumer harm. And it's actually affecting us when some of you say, well, this mythical XYZ don't do that. Well, they don't do that because they haven't bothered. They don't do that probably because they don't understand what needs doing. So it feels wrong that we should be punished because somebody else doesn't have a clue what they're doing and doesn't care about the regulations. So watch this space. I think Ross's interpretation is right. The notion that you should only be adding a network number where it's an international call is nonsensical to me, and defeats the entire object. Takes the legs, if you like, off the whole principle.
So are you are you still showing that number?
It's intermittent. We've had further reports, but they've told us it's fixed. It is worth saying, actually, we invited a couple of people from Ofcom, including the person that sent that email. Unfortunately, we did do it at short notice, so they're not here. Although whether or not inviting Ofcom to SimCon is a great idea, I don't know. But they have actually very proactively. They're aware of these issues, and I've had a discussion with a couple of people recently, and have invited me to speak with them next week as well, to actively engage with us on how to fix this. Because I think common sense, I've sort of presented it in a similar way to this, to Ofcom, and said, look, this is what you've said, this is what people expect, this is what we think you were going for, but don't seem to have quite done. And I get the feeling, the general consensus is that they agree with us. The whole point is reducing consumer harm. The whole point is not having numbers that you don't recognise or that don't exist phoning you, and yet no one's implemented that yet. As written, it would go a long way to stop a lot of nuisance calling. It would go a long way to stop a lot of marketing spam. It would be great, but as enforced or as enacted by various other CPs, it's just caused a lot of confusion. So
well, that's
Give him the mic.
That's as that's as with most things.
Can we just get you a lapel mic? Just
Yeah, sorry. Sorry, but that's as with most things. You can tell the underlying reason why they've started to do something, but as you've demonstrated with the documents, the written "this is
Yeah.
how you should be doing things,"
it's different.
and it's too wide. Yeah.
Yeah. As Neil said as well, I mean, maybe the 0800 thing's an error. It wouldn't surprise me.
I don't think it is. If you see it, was an 0800 number.
Because you can see why you wouldn't want somebody
I
called Childline, for example.
I don't know how feasible Martin's going to hate me, but I don't know how feasible it is to bring Tom in if he's still lurking. But while Martin sort of gets stressed and tries that, just to give a US perspective on it, I was chatting to Tom the other day, and there's a number of initiatives over there that have all but eliminated robocalls over there now. So rate limits and various other things within the carrier network. So use of CLI and frequency of CLI have dramatically reduced that. Stir Shaken will effectively, for those that are compliant, will effectively eliminate offshore call centres firing calls into the country with spoofed caller ID. And in my experience, the FCC are the iron fist within the iron glove, but actually they have a brain. And I think it's kind of ironic that we're the ones with the Mickey Mouse regulation. To be perfectly frank, not wanting to make your meeting next week
They've gone
awkward.
for a nice technical solution as well. That's rare. Well, yeah.
But if you want my help at that meeting, I'm more than happy to attend. So,
Yeah.
speak of the devil.
Oh, there we go.
Martin, you're a legend.
Thanks, Martin. Tom. I don't think he can hear us.
Hello. Yes, I can.
Awesome. Martin, can we have a slightly higher level? Tom?
Yes, hello.
Excellent.
I have been listening, Simon. It's actually very interesting to me to actually go through the last two presentations. It is much the exercise that we had to go through about 5 years ago. So to see this level coming into Europe is quite exciting, actually, to me. We have many of the same rules that you've been talking about. We have what we call over here our CP&I rules, which are consumer protection rules on how we adhere to privacy. We also have, as you alluded to, what's now called Shake and Stir, which is the authentication of caller ID. So the ID is loaded by the owner of the number, i.e. the carrier, and authenticated and then passed on down the line to make sure that before that call is delivered, you're not dealing with a spoofed ID. The FCC over here has basically declared war on robocalls. The idea of calling cell phones, the idea of calling home phones with spoofed numbers to get people to answer and run scams is major war, and all carriers, including Simwood, will be required, or let's say forcefully nudged, to comply with Shake and Stir by the end of 2019. But we have had compliance for caller ID for at least 5 years now. That's a little bit more related to our jurisdictional indicators, meaning that we charge differently than you do. As many of you may be aware or not, we have what we call interstate and intrastate. Calls that originate and terminate within a state are from one state to another. And the only way you can charge those calls is to know where the call comes from. We deal with what's called a BTN, so we also use the paid header and the RPID headers, and we use those more for what is referred to as I'm trying to think, the BTN is what they call it.
Billing telephone number.
Yeah, built a number. Yeah. Thanks, Tom.
I'm actually on a good connection here, and I apologize. So that's real live communication there. And I had a dog that was in my side of the office that decided to bark, and I thought I would save you guys all that trouble. So I jumped real quick to grab him. That being said, it's much the same. So everything that you're going through now is what we will have to comply with in the United States as well. And we do also use E164 headers. So when we're dealing with what we call international calls or calls from Europe or the UK, the way that we manage those calls is to make sure that the caller ID is an E164 compliant header.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Tom.
Okay?
Any more questions? Go on, give Ross a really hard one.
I think probably when can we leave and go to the bar? Yeah.
From Ofcom, you've got valid and dialable. So valid, I understand, is in the national numbering plan. Dialable, if a telephone number is in the numbering plan but hasn't been assigned to a subscriber, is that still, do you believe, classed as dialable?
It's
so how do you
not
know
dialable. Good question. At the moment, there isn't a way of ensuring that. So basically, they've accepted that if it's assigned to a CP for the purposes of inbound, that's enough, because we can't determine if it's dialable. Although it's still, the word dialable still exists in the spec. But if it's assigned to CP, that's fine. If it's not assigned at all, then that should be blocked.
Is there a condition of that cost as well? The cost.
The condition for cost only applies where it's an outbound call to a consumer, e.g. for
The return.
yeah, but it's not a case of no call at all, as far as I understand it. I suppose you can. Good question.
You can't present an 08.
You can't present a premium rate service for an outbound call. No, so you can't present. But I don't think it's specifically a charge thing. I think it is termed. It must be a standard number, but it's not standard rate. I'd need to look up exactly what it is, because 01, 02, 03 are obviously fine, but 07 for mobile is fine. But the question is 070, which is personal PNS, is that allowed? I'm not sure, but certainly 09 you can't present, but 0800 you can, but 0871 you can't. So it is a bit of an odd situation. That answer everything? Well, there's someone at the back. Someone has to ask,
Just a very quick one. I know this was a reasonable amount of work for us internally, and you sort of alluded to getting to the point of giving up. There was a big list of large operators not complying. Are you seeing any signs that they are complying or intend to comply?
We're aware that they're intending to comply. We've had various, obviously some of them we've got a bit of a direct relationship with, and we can talk to other people. Case in point, for instance, when we don't have a direct relationship with, Virgin on that list, we do, but not Virgin. So that was Virgin, like domestic home. That was because my parents use Virgin for their landline, and we're getting called 5-6 times a day by the same invalid range, but it was invalid every time. In the end, I emailed them and said, look, you've got an obligation to stop this, and got a reply back saying, well, no, we don't. And then I sent them the link to Ofcom, and the first person who replied, okay, it was someone just in a support queue. That doesn't apply to us. I'm like, well, that's clever. It's Ofcom. It applies to everyone. Eventually, I got a more sensible response, which was, we're aware of the change in regulation, and we're looking at how this affects our business. So, yeah. EE, on the other hand, have actively treated every case we've raised as a fault. They've said it will be corrected. It just seems that historically most people sent the same network number and presentation number, and they never noticed. It's worth noting, if anyone uses BT-IPX. I used to work for a provider that did use it. We don't have a relationship with IPX, but I went back through sort of old documentation, old notes I had on it, and actually it's in there. In fact, it's downloadable from the BT OpenReach or BT Wholesale website. It's in there that some networks may not respect a presentation number. So it was known that it was an issue 6 or 7 years ago, but 6 or 7 years ago it didn't matter. It now does. So everyone just needs to get their ducks in a row and make it work.
I think the other point is the GC6 compliance is one thing. GC6 builds on a presumption of compliance with the NICC guidance that Ross mentioned, which is what, 15, 20 years?
So the most that revision is 2007. So yeah, 12 years old.
But so there's a presumption that people did that 12 years ago. All this has done is shine a light on that non-compliance that was previously invisible. I think the other point to make is our our halfway house to turning this off is recognizing that those of you that are virtual interconnect customers and managed interconnect customers, and in particular where we host your number ranges, we're effectively treating you as a PECN. So there is an argument that you are the point of ingress or egress to the PSTN. So for those of you that wish to assume responsibility of this yourselves, to an extent that you think is appropriate, and you reminded me of this Matt, there's an annex to your contract. We'll put a flag on your account, and then we don't do any of this GC6 rubbish, because it is up to you to implement it to the extent you see appropriate.
Yeah.
As far as us as interconnect partners are concerned, if Ofcom come to us and say, are you implementing this? Is it acceptable for us to simply pass that off and say, well, we're not doing it because we partner with Simwood and they're doing it? Or do we have to have some internal document
Not
that
yet.
says...
Not yet. We did touch on that earlier. We are aiming to have a solution where we can say we're 100% compliant, tick this box, and it becomes our problem. But obviously, Neil would not advise us to do so unless we were absolutely sure, because we would then be assuming liability. As far as we can, because of course the general conditions do say that every CP in the chain is liable, but they then also qualify it by you can prove compliance by showing that you've got a contract with another provider that is enforcing this. So we'll need to review that.
And just to be a realist, Ofcom don't have a track record of enforcing their rules absolutely and uniformly across the market. They have a tendency to pick on test cases, and I think it's fair to say that, no disrespect intended to anybody in this room or even ourselves, there's bigger fish out there that are non-compliant at the moment than
Definitely not bothered to be
and any of us here, yeah. And if they are bothered about enforcing general conditions, there's others that I would much sooner than focus on, such as normal portability, number portability, general condition 18. But that's another rant for another day.
Or an MNC.
Indeed. I think he's ranted on.
Yeah. More once.
But Ofcom have already said they're committed to maintaining 4 mobile providers in the UK. You can interpret that in one of 2 ways.
Excellent. Is that everything? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ross. That was brilliant.